Blood stained the cobblestones of Ethelgard, but the real tragedy was rotting in its dungeons. A woman accused of high treason sat shivering in the dark, waiting for the executioner's axe. She had no allies, no hope, and no voice to defend herself against the Alpha King's wrath. But then, an impossible sentinel arrived, a monstrous, pitch-black hound, a beast known only to answer to the king himself, laid its massive body across the iron bars of her cell. It bared its teeth at the guards. It refused to eat, and for 6 agonizing days, it didn't move. Why? Water dripped in a slow, maddening rhythm from the arched stone ceiling of the Ethelgard keep. Beatrice Sterling huddled in the furthest corner of her cell, her knees pulled tightly to her chest, trying to preserve whatever warmth remained in her frail body. The air in the royal dungeons tasted of rust, old blood, and damp earth. It had been 2 days since she had seen the sun. 2 days since she had been violently stripped of her title as the royal apothecary and cast into the abyss, branded a murderer by the only man she had ever loved. Beatrice was no wolf. In a kingdom ruled by lycanthropes, where strength was measured in fang and claw, she was merely human. Yet she had possessed a different kind of power, the power to heal. Her knowledge of herbs, tinctures, and ancient remedies had earned her a place in the High Court, and eventually a place in the heart of the Alpha King, Cailan Hastings. But human fragility was a liability in the brutal politics of the wolf courts, and Cailan's advisors had demanded he take a pure-blood mate to secure the lineage. He had chosen Lady Genevieve of the Northern Wastes, a cruel, beautiful creature who had despised Beatrice from the moment she arrived. When Genevieve was found dead in her chambers, her veins blackened by nightshade, the blame fell swiftly. The poison had been traced to Beatrice's apothecary satchel. The evidence was overwhelming, perfectly planted. Cailan, blinded by the political uproar and the undeniable proof, had condemned her to the executioner's block without a trial. "Filthy human," a voice sneered from the corridor. It was Guard Captain Richard, a burly wolf whose disdain for Beatrice had always been poorly veiled. He rattled his iron baton against the heavy bars of her cell, causing her to flinch. "Enjoying your accommodations, poisoner. 4 days until the full moon. 4 days until your head rolls." Beatrice didn't answer. She simply closed her eyes, the memory of Cailan's face flashing in her mind. When he pronounced her sentence in the great hall, his voice had been devoid of emotion, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked carved from granite. He hadn't even looked her in the eye. That had hurt worse than the cold stones beneath her. Suddenly, a low, guttural growl echoed down the spiraling stone staircase. It was a sound that vibrated through the very foundations of the castle, a sound that made even the battle-hardened guards freeze in their tracks. Heavy, padded footsteps descended the stairs. The rhythmic click-clack of massive claws on stone signaled the arrival of a creature born of nightmares. Out of the shadows emerged Balthazar. He was a dire hound, a terrifying crossbreed of a mastiff and an ancient timber wolf, standing as tall as a pony at the shoulder. His fur was the color of midnight, scarred and matted from countless wars fought alongside the Alpha King. Balthazar was a legend in Ethelgard. He answered only to Cailan, serving as the king's personal executioner on the battlefield and his silent shadow in the throne room. To the kingdom, Balthazar was the physical embodiment of the king's wrath. Guard Captain Richard backed away, his hand instinctively dropping to the hilt of his sword. "Easy, beast," he muttered, pressing his back against the damp corridor wall. "What are you doing down here?" Balthazar ignored the captain, his golden eyes, glowing like twin lanterns in the dim torchlight, locked onto Beatrice's cell. He moved with slow, deliberate grace, his massive frame blocking the narrow passageway. When he reached the iron bars of her cage, he stopped. Beatrice held her breath, pressing herself further into the wall. Was this it? Had Cailan decided not to wait for the executioner? Had he sent his monster to tear her throat out in the dark? Balthazar pressed his wet, scarred snout against the iron bars. He let out a long, heavy exhale, the hot air puffing into the freezing cell. Then, to the absolute astonishment of the guards, the colossal beast turned around in a tight circle and collapsed heavily onto the stone floor, his massive back pressed firmly against the bars of her cell door. "Shoo! Get out of here, you fleabag!" A younger guard stepped forward, raising a spear. Balthazar didn't even stand. He simply turned his massive head, pulling back his jowls to reveal teeth the size of daggers. A snarl ripped from his chest, so vicious and deafening that the young guard dropped his spear and scrambled backward, tripping over his own boots. The beast laid his head on his massive paws, his golden eyes fixed on the corridor, standing guard. "Leave him." Captain Richard swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill. "If the king wants his hound sleeping in the rot, let him. He'll get hungry and leave by morning." But Balthazar did not leave. Hour after hour passed, the damp chill settling deep into Beatrice's bones. The shadows lengthened and danced as the torches burned low, but the massive black silhouette outside her door remained entirely motionless. Beatrice crept closer to the bars, her curiosity momentarily overriding her despair. She remembered Balthazar from the courtyard. Everyone gave him a wide berth. Even Cailan handled the beast with a cautious respect. Yet, here he was. "Why are you here?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. Balthazar's ears twitched. He shifted slightly, pushing his broad, fur-covered back harder against the iron, as if trying to share his immense body heat through the cold metal. For the first time in 2 days, Beatrice felt a sliver of warmth radiating into her freezing cell. She reached out a trembling, dirt-stained hand, hesitating for a fraction of a second before resting her fingers lightly on the thick, coarse fur poking through the bars. The dire hound let out a soft, rumbling sigh, leaning into her touch. By the 3rd day, the entire castle was whispering. The Alpha King's legendary hound had not moved from the dungeons. He refused the raw venison the kennel master brought him, snarling ferociously whenever anyone, guard, servant, or lord, stepped within 10 feet of Beatrice's cell. The guards had essentially abandoned the lower level, terrified of the beast that guarded the condemned human. Inside the cell, Beatrice was starving, but her spirit was no longer entirely broken. A bizarre, silent companionship had formed between her and the monster. Balthazar had become her anchor in the dark. On the morning of the 4th day, Beatrice awoke to a wet nose nudging her hand through the bars. She blinked open her heavy eyes to see Balthazar holding something in his jaws. He dropped it carefully between the iron grates. It was a partially mangled, but perfectly edible, roasted pheasant. He had snuck out during the shift change, raided the kitchen, and returned before anyone could stop him. "You shouldn't have," Beatrice whispered, tears stinging her eyes as she tore into the meat. "They'll beat you for stealing." Balthazar merely laid his large head down, watching her eat with a soft, intelligent gaze. As she chewed, her mind drifted back to a time before the cold stones and impending death. She remembered the summer solstice festival just a year ago. She had slipped away from the loud, boisterous werewolf celebrations to sit by the whispering willows of the Moon Lake. Cailan had found her there. He hadn't been wearing his crown or his heavy royal furs. He had just been Cailan, the boy who used to sneak into the apothecary to watch her grind herbs, the man who looked at her as if she were the only bright thing in his violent world. "I am the king, Beatrice," he had whispered that night, his forehead resting against hers. "I make the laws. I can change them. I will not marry Genevieve. I will choose you." It was a beautiful, foolish lie. The pressure from Lord Arthur Pendleton, the head of the Alpha Council, had been insurmountable. A human queen would incite a rebellion. And so, Kaelin had yielded to his duty. The betrayal had shattered Beatrice, but she had stayed in Ethelgard, because leaving meant never seeing him again. Now, she was paying the ultimate price for her lingering heart. The heavy thud of boots echoing down the stairs pulled her from her memories. Balthazar stood up instantly, the fur along his spine rising into a rigid mohawk. A low, threatening rumble vibrated in his throat. Beatrice peered through the gloom. The flickering torchlight illuminated a tall, broad-shouldered figure wrapped in a heavy winter cloak. It was Kaelin. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs, his sharp, amber eyes locking onto the massive black hound blocking the cell. His face was a mask of exhaustion. Dark circles bruised the skin beneath his eyes, and his usually immaculate dark hair was dishevelled. "Balthazar!" Kaelin commanded, his voice a rich, authoritative baritone that made Beatrice's heart physically ache. "Come here. Now." The hound did not move. Instead, he planted his massive paws firmly on the stone and bared his teeth at his master. Kaelin's jaw tightened. "I said, come." He took a step forward. Balthazar barked, a sharp, deafening sound that cracked like thunder in the confined space. He lunged forward slightly, snapping his jaws mere inches from Kaelin's boots, driving the king back a step. Kaelin stared at his beast in sheer disbelief. Balthazar was bound to him by blood and ancient magic. The hound had never disobeyed a direct order in its life. Kaelin's gaze slowly shifted past the snarling beast, meeting Beatrice's eyes through the bars. She looked terrible. Her simple linen dress was covered in dirt and soot, her skin pale and drawn, her lips cracked. Yet she held his gaze with a defiant, unbroken pride. "Are you using your witchcraft on my hound, human?" Kaelin asked, his voice dripping with a bitter, defensive poison. He was trying to sound like a king, but Beatrice could hear the fracture in his tone. "I have no magic, Kaelin," she replied softly, her voice barely carrying over Balthazar's continuous growling. "Only the truth. A truth you refuse to hear." "The truth was in your room," Kaelin snapped, stepping forward again, only to be met by another vicious snap from Balthazar. "Lord Pendleton found the nightshade hidden beneath your floorboards, the exact poison that killed my betrothed. You were jealous. You let your emotions cloud your judgment, and you committed treason." "I am an apothecary," she cried out, clutching the iron bars. Balthazar immediately flanked her, pressing his side against her hands in a protective stance. "Nightshade is kept in the apothecary vault, which a dozen people have access to. I didn't kill her. Why would I? I had already accepted that you belonged to her." Kaelin looked away, the muscle in his jaw feathering. He looked at the massive hound, who was currently licking Beatrice's dirty fingers, his golden eyes glaring daggers at the king. "He knows what you are," Kaelin said quietly, pointing at the dog. "He knows the darkness in you, just like I do now. He's guarding you to ensure you don't escape your fate." "He's guarding me from you," Beatrice countered fiercely. Kaelin's amber eyes flared with a mix of fury and profound sorrow. He stood there for a long moment, the silence thick and heavy between them, broken only by the dripping water and the hound's low panting. Then, without another word, the Alpha King turned on his heel and disappeared back up the stairs, leaving the dungeon to the dark. Day 5 brought the fever. The relentless dampness of the dungeon had finally infiltrated Beatrice's lungs. She lay curled on the freezing stone floor, shivering violently, her skin burning to the touch while her core felt like it was encased in ice. She was hallucinating, muttering old herbal recipes and whispering Kaelin's name into the empty air. Outside the bars, Balthazar was in a state of sheer panic. The stoic, terrifying war hound paced frantically back and forth. He whined, a high-pitched, pathetic sound completely uncharacteristic of his monstrous size. He thrust his paws through the bars, trying to pull her closer to him, but she was too weak to move toward the iron. By nightfall, Balthazar threw his head back and howled. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated mourning. The mournful wail echoed up the stone shafts, drifting through the courtyard, penetrating the thick glass of the great hall and sending shivers down the spine of every wolf in Ethelgard. It was a death knell. The guards in the upper levels clamped their hands over their ears, unnerved by the sheer emotion pouring from the beast. When the dawn of the 6th day broke, the fever had sapped the last of Beatrice's strength. Today was the full moon. Today was execution day. She could hear the heavy marching of boots descending the stairs. It wasn't just 2 guards this time. It sounded like a dozen. At the head of the pack was Lord Arthur Pendleton. He was a distinguished, silver-haired wolf with a sharp, aristocratic face and eyes like polished flint. As the head of the Alpha Council, he had personally overseen the investigation into Genevieve's death. He wore his formal ceremonial robes of deep crimson, a silver chain of office draped heavily over his chest. "Move the beast," Lord Pendleton commanded, waving a gloved hand toward the cell. "The king requires the prisoner in the courtyard. The headsman is waiting." Captain Richard and 5 heavily armed guards stepped forward, holding long iron pikes. "Come on, Balthazar. Move away." "Good boy," Richard coaxed, though his voice shook. Balthazar did not growl this time. He didn't bark. He went completely, terrifyingly still. The fur on his massive body stood on end, making him look twice his size. His lips curled back silently, exposing gums black with rage. "Thrust him back," Pendleton barked impatiently. "He is just a dog. Use the pikes." 2 guards stepped forward, thrusting the blunt ends of their iron pikes toward the hound. Faster than the eye could track, Balthazar snapped his jaws around the wooden shaft of the nearest pike and crushed it into splinters. He lunged forward, throwing his immense weight against the iron bars of the cell, shaking the entire foundation of the dungeon. The guards scattered in sheer terror. "Cowards!" Lord Pendleton spat. He drew a silver-hilted dagger from his belt, a weapon toxic to lycanthropes and equally deadly to dire hounds. "If the beast has gone rabid, then put him down." Pendleton stepped forward, raising the silver dagger. As the lord approached the cell, an abrupt change came over Balthazar. The hound's frantic rage suddenly crystallized into hyper-focused aggression. Balthazar's nose twitched wildly. He inhaled deeply, pulling the scent of Lord Pendleton into his lungs. Instead of attacking the dagger, Balthazar lunged sideways, ignoring the silver blade completely. His massive jaws clamped down onto the thick crimson fabric of Lord Pendleton's ceremonial cloak, violently jerking the powerful councilman off his feet and slamming him into the dungeon wall. "Get him off me!" Pendleton screamed, dropping the silver dagger as the hound's heavy paws pinned his shoulders to the stone. Balthazar wasn't biting his flesh. He was viciously tearing at the heavy, velvet-lined pockets of Pendleton's inner robes. The hound ripped a chunk of fabric away, and a small, leather-bound pouch clattered to the damp stone floor. The impact caused the pouch to burst open, spilling a cluster of dried, dark purple leaves and a glass vial filled with a black, viscous liquid. The distinct, suffocating scent of concentrated nightshade immediately filled the narrow corridor. At that exact moment, the heavy oak door at the top of the stairs slammed open. Cailan Hastings rushed down the steps, his royal sword drawn, having heard the commotion from the upper halls. He froze halfway down the staircase, his amber eyes wide as he took in the scene, his councilman pinned against the wall by his warhound, his guards cowering, and the unmistakable deadly dark leaves scattered across the stone floor. "What is the meaning of this?" Cailan's voice thundered, vibrating with alpha power. Balthazar released Pendleton and took a step back. The enormous hound looked at the king, then deliberately placed his massive paw directly over the spilled pouch of nightshade, letting out a low, rumbling growl as he stared unblinkingly at the terrified lord. Kaelin's eyes darted from the poison under his dog's paw to the ripped pocket on Pendleton's chest, and finally to the dark, feverish figure of Beatrice slumped inside the cell. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in his mind with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't been guarding the prisoner to ensure she didn't escape. The beast, possessing senses infinitely sharper than any man or wolf, had known the truth from the very beginning. Balthazar hadn't been standing outside her cell to keep the murderer in. He had been sitting outside her cell for 6 days to keep the real murderers out. Silence, thicker and heavier than the dungeon's stagnant air, descended upon the stone corridor. The only sounds were the ragged, wet breathing of the dying woman in the cell, and the low, menacing rumble still vibrating in Balthazar's chest. Kaelin's amber eyes remained locked on the crushed leather pouch beneath his hound's paw. The dark, viscous liquid seeping into the stone was unmistakable. It was the distilled essence of Atropa belladonna, deadly nightshade, the very poison that had stopped Genevieve's heart. "My king!" Lord Arthur Pendleton choked out, his voice a pathetic, reedy squeak as he pressed himself flat against the damp wall. He held his hands up, trembling violently. This is a misunderstanding. The beast is rabid. It planted the evidence. You cannot possibly believe a dog planted a sealed pouch of nightshade in the breast pocket of your ceremonial robes. Kaelin's voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried a lethal edge that made the remaining guards instinctively drop to their knees. The Alpha King's aura flared, a suffocating, invisible pressure that forced every wolf in the room to lower their heads in primal submission. Kaelin took a slow, deliberate step down the stairs. A pouch that smells precisely of the private apothecary reserves of the capital. Reserves you insisted I seal off after the murder. Pendleton's aristocratic face drained of all colour. He looked wildly at the guards, but Captain Richard had his face pressed to the cobblestones, unwilling to meet the king's eyes. "She is a human witch, Kaelin," Pendleton screamed, his composure entirely shattering. "She bewitched your hound. She conspired to murder Lady Genevieve to steal the throne, and now she is trying to frame your most loyal advisor. You must execute her now." With a roar that shook the iron bars of the cells, Kaelin crossed the distance between them in a blur of motion. He didn't use his sword. He grabbed Lord Pendleton by the heavily embroidered collar of his crimson robes, lifting the grown man entirely off his feet and slamming him back against the stone wall with bone-shattering force. "Do not insult my intelligence, Arthur," Kaelin snarled, his fangs elongating as his lycanthrope nature breached the surface of his humanity. "Why? Why did you kill my betrothed and frame the woman I loved?" Pendleton gasped for air, his hands clawing uselessly at Kaelin's iron grip. "Genevieve, she was no loyal mate," he wheezed. "She found the ledgers, the private trading records of Silas Mercer, my associate in the East. She discovered I had been selling our kingdom's silver reserves to the rebel factions. She demanded my seat on the council, or she would expose me to you." The absolute betrayal hit Kaelin like a physical blow. The councilmen he had trusted above all others had been arming their enemies. "And Beatrice?" Kaelin's voice broke on her name. "Why her?" "Two birds, one stone," Pendleton spat, blood trickling from his nose. "The kingdom despised the human. I needed a scapegoat for Genevieve's murder, and I needed to remove the weak, bleeding heart apothecary who was softening our Alpha King. You were meant to be a weapon, Kaelin, not a lovesick whelp pining after a fragile mortal." Kaelin's eyes glowed a terrifying, luminous gold. He dropped Pendleton to the floor in a heap. "Captain Richard," Kaelin commanded, his voice cold and devoid of any mercy. The captain scrambled to his feet, saluting shakily. "Yes, my king." Strip Lord Pendleton of his titles, his robes, and his dignity. Throw him in the lowest pit of this dungeon. If he speaks, remove his tongue. He will face a public execution at dawn." As the guards dragged the screaming, thrashing councilman up the stairs, Cailan turned slowly toward the cell, the anger drained out of him, replaced instantly by a crushing, suffocating wave of guilt. Balthazar was standing by the iron bars, his golden eyes watching Cailan intently. The massive hound did not growl this time. He simply stepped aside, leaving the path to the door clear. With trembling hands, Cailan retrieved the heavy iron keys from the peg on the wall and unlocked the cell. The hinges screamed in protest as he pulled the heavy door open. The stench of sickness and damp rot hit him immediately. Beatrice was curled into a tiny fetal ball in the corner, her breathing horribly shallow. Her skin was translucent, stretched tightly over her cheekbones, and covered in a sheen of freezing sweat. Cailan fell to his knees beside her, ignoring the filth soaking into his trousers. "Beatrice," he whispered, his voice cracking. He reached out, his large hands gently cupping her face. She was burning with a horrific fever. "Gods above, Beatrice, I am so sorry. I am so sorry." She didn't open her eyes. Her lips parted, but only a dry, rattling breath escaped. Panic seized Cailan's chest. He slipped his arms beneath her frail body and lifted her. She weighed practically nothing. She felt like a broken bird in his arms. As he stood, Balthazar let out a soft, mournful whine, nudging Beatrice's dangling hand with his wet nose. "You saved her, old friend," Cailan said to the hound, a tear finally escaping and cutting a clean path down his dirt-streaked face. "You were the only one who saw the truth." Cailan turned and sprinted up the stairs, holding her tightly against his chest, screaming for the royal healers. The king's private chambers were a flurry of chaotic, desperate motion. The massive hearth roared with a roaring fire, banishing the chill of the castle. But Beatrice could not stop shivering. She lay in the center of Cailan's massive four-poster bed, buried beneath layers of thick wolf-pelt blankets. 3 royal healers fluttered around her, applying cold compresses to her forehead and forcing a bitter, glowing green tonic past her cracked lips. Cailan paced at the foot of the bed like a caged predator. He had refused to leave the room, completely ignoring the political crisis unfolding in the kingdom below. The Alpha Council was in an uproar over Pendleton's sudden arrest, but Cailan didn't care if the entire castle burned to the ground. Not if Beatrice didn't survive. Balthazar had followed them up from the dungeons and refused to be ushered out. The colossal dire hound lay curled on the rug right beside the bed, his chin resting on his massive paws, his eyes never leaving Beatrice's pale face. "Her lungs are severely compromised, my king," the head healer, a stooped elder named Master Hemlock, said gravely. "The dungeon rot has set in deeply. But there is something else. Her pulse is erratic, unnaturally slow for a fever this high." "What are you saying?" Cailan demanded, stopping his pacing. Hemlock hesitated, holding up a small glass vial filled with the water from Beatrice's dungeon cell. He had ordered it brought up for testing. "I compared the symptoms to the medical journals of Thomas Sydenham, the human physician she kept in her apothecary library. This isn't just a natural fever. The water in her cell was tainted, a slow-acting derivative of wolfsbane, cut with stagnant pond moss. It is highly toxic to humans. Pendleton wasn't going to leave her survival to chance. He wanted her dead before she could ever stand before an executioner to speak her piece." Cailan felt the blood roar in his ears. Every breath Beatrice struggled to take was another knife twisting in his gut. He had put her down there. He had condemned her to the dark. He had abandoned her to a murderer. "Cure her," Cailan ordered, his voice trembling. "Use whatever you need. Empty the royal vaults." "We have administered the antivenom, sire, but her human body is too frail to fight both the poison and the pneumonia simultaneously. She needs a catalyst, something to rapidly accelerate her cellular regeneration, or her heart will simply stop beating by midnight. Kaelin looked at Master Hemlock, a fierce determination igniting in his amber eyes. My blood. The healer gasped, taking a step back. Sire, alpha blood is incredibly volatile. If administered to a human, it could tear her mind apart. The agonizing pain of the lycanthrope healing properties will save her life, Kaelin interrupted, drawing a silver dagger from his belt. I will not lose her, Hemlock. Do it. The healers exchanged terrified glances, but did not dare defy their king. Hemlock quickly prepared a silver chalice, mixing a base of soothing poppy milk and moonflower extract to dull the impending pain. Kaelin sliced the palm of his hand open without a flinch. Rich, dark crimson blood welled up, glowing with a faint, unnatural heat. He let it drip into the chalice until it was mixed perfectly with the herbs. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Kaelin gently lifted Beatrice's head, resting her against his chest. He could feel her heartbeat, a terrifyingly weak flutter, like a dying moth. Drink, my love, he whispered, pressing the rim of the chalice to her lips. Please, Beatrice, come back to me. He carefully tipped the liquid into her mouth, stroking her throat to force her to swallow. For a terrifying, endless minute, nothing happened. The room held its breath. Even Balthazar stood up, his ears perked forward. Then, Beatrice arched off the bed with a sudden, violent gasp. Her eyes snapped open, wide, unfocused, and dilated with shock. A deep flush of color violently rushed into her pale cheeks. The alpha blood hit her system like a bolt of lightning, ravaging the poison and jump-starting her failing organs. She screamed, a raw, ragged sound of pure agony as the lycanthrope magic violently repaired her damaged lungs. "Hold her!" Hemlock shouted. Kaelin wrapped his arms securely around her thrashing body, holding her tight against him. "I've got you! I'm here! I've got you!" he chanted into her hair, tears openly falling from his eyes as she sobbed in pain. Slowly, agonizingly, the thrashing subsided. Her ragged breathing deepened, becoming steady and strong. The terrifying heat of the fever began to break, replaced by the natural warmth of a living, healthy human. Beatrice lay limp against Kaelin's chest, utterly exhausted. She blinked, the hazy fog of delirium finally lifting from her vision. She looked at the heavy velvet curtains, the roaring fire, and finally, up at the face of the man holding her. Kaelin looked down at her, a trembling smile of profound relief breaking across his exhausted face. "You're safe," he whispered, gently brushing a damp lock of hair from her forehead. "You're safe, Beatrice. I know the truth. Pendleton is in chains. It's over." He leaned down, burying his face in her neck, breathing in the scent of her skin, expecting her to wrap her arms around him, expecting the nightmare to finally end. But Beatrice didn't embrace him. Slowly she pulled her hands away from his chest. She pushed against his shoulders, forcing him to create distance between them. Her eyes, though clear of the fever, were cold and guarded. "Beatrice?" Kaelin asked, confusion warring with the relief in his chest. She looked at the opulent bed, then at the healers, and finally her gaze drifted down to the floor, where Balthazar sat. The giant hound whined happily, thumping his massive tail against the floorboards. Beatrice managed a weak, fragile smile for the beast. She reached down a trembling hand, and Balthazar eagerly pushed his scarred snout into her palm. Then she looked back at the Alpha King. "You didn't see the truth, Kaelin," she said, her voice raspy and weak, but carrying a weight that shattered the silence of the room. "The dog did." Kaelin flinched as if she had struck him. "When the council demanded my head, you didn't question them," she continued, her eyes filling with tears that she stubbornly refused to let fall. "When they found the poison in my room, You didn't ask me for an explanation. You didn't even look me in the eye when you sent me to the dark to rot." "I was blinded," Kaelin pleaded, reaching for her hand, but she pulled it away. "The evidence. Genevieve's family was threatening war. I had to act as a king, and you acted," Beatrice whispered, pulling the heavy furs tighter around herself. "But a king who is so easily manipulated by a lie is a dangerous man to love. I survived the dungeon, Kaelin, but whatever we had, it died down there on the cold stone. I will not be your queen, and I will not be your fool." She turned her head away from him, staring into the roaring flames of the hearth. "Now please, ask your healers to leave. I am very tired." Kaelin sat frozen on the edge of the bed. He had saved her life. He had executed her tormentor. But as he stared at the woman he loved, he realized a terrifying truth. Pulling her out of the dungeon was the easy part. Winning back the heart he had broken was going to be the hardest battle the Alpha King had ever fought. Winter descended upon Ethelgard with a brutal, unforgiving swiftness, mirroring the frost that had settled over the royal wing. 3 months had passed since the night in the dungeon, and while Beatrice's physical scars had faded, the invisible chasm between her and Kaelin had only grown wider. She had moved out of the royal chambers the moment she was strong enough to walk, relocating to a modest stone cottage on the outer edge of the castle grounds, adjacent to the royal herb gardens. Kaelin had not stopped her. He had ordered the cottage furnished with the finest tapestries and warmest hearths, but Beatrice had quietly requested the luxuries be removed. She wanted nothing that belonged to the king. Instead, she buried herself in her work. She imported rare texts, studying the complex botanical theories of Master Henry Cavendish, a real and highly respected physician from the distant human city of York, whose pioneering work on digitalis and heart ailments she used to treat the kingdom's elderly. Her apothecary flourished. Wolves and humans alike came to her door, realizing that the woman who had survived the king's wrath and tamed his monster was no mere mortal. But every evening, without fail, a shadow would fall over her doorstep. Balthazar. The colossal dire hound spent his days at Kaelin's side during council meetings and military drills, but the moment the sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the Ethelgard Mountains, he abandoned his master to sleep on the woven rug by Beatrice's fire. Kaelin never commanded the beast to stay. It was as if the king was sending a piece of his own soul to watch over her, knowing he was no longer welcome to do so himself. One bitterly cold afternoon, as Beatrice was grinding dried willow bark into a fine powder for fever remedies, a heavy knock echoed through the cottage. She wiped her hands on her linen apron and opened the thick oak door. Kaelin stood on her threshold. The Alpha King looked worn. The rebellion sparked by Lord Pendleton's execution had tested his military might, and the political unrest was etching deep lines into his handsome face. He wore no crown, only a heavy wool cloak dusted with fresh snow. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice low and hesitant. Beatrice stepped aside, her expression unreadable. "Of course, Your Grace." He flinched at the formal title. He stepped into the warmth of the cottage, the scent of crushed lavender and sharp peppermint filling his senses. He looked around the simple room, his eyes lingering on the neat rows of glass vials and the large mortar and pestle. "You look well, Beatrice," Kaelin said softly, his amber eyes searching hers for any sign of the warmth that used to exist between them. "I am well," she replied, keeping her distance, standing behind her wooden workbench as if it were a shield. "Was there something you needed from the apothecary, sire? A draught for the winter chill? Or perhaps something for the insomnia? Master Hemlock tells me you haven't been sleeping." "I don't need a potion, Beatrice. I need you." The words tore from his throat, raw and desperate. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them. The rebellion in the east is quelled. The council is purged of Pendleton's loyalists. The kingdom is secure. I am officially a free man, unbound by any betrothal or political demand. I want you to return to the keep. I want you to be my queen." Beatrice stopped wiping down her marble counter. She looked up at him, her heart giving a painful, involuntary squeeze. He was beautiful, powerful, and he was offering her the world she had once dreamed of. But the cold memory of the dungeon iron was burned too deeply into her soul. "Kaelin," she breathed, her voice trembling slightly. "You cannot simply execute the men who lied to you and expect everything to reset. You purged the council, yes, but you haven't purged the doubt in your own heart. When the entire kingdom screamed that I was a murderer, you chose their voices over my truth." "I was a fool," Kaelin pleaded, reaching across the workbench to grasp her hands. His skin was burning hot against hers. "I have paid for that foolishness every single day since I pulled you from that cell. Tell me what to do, Beatrice. Tell me how to earn your forgiveness. I will walk through fire. I will give up the crown. Name your price." Beatrice gently but firmly pulled her hands from his grip. "My price is my freedom," she said softly, the finality in her voice dropping the temperature in the room. "I am leaving Ethelgard, Kaelin. I have secured passage with a merchant caravan travelling to York. I leave at first light." Kaelin froze. The blood drained from his face, leaving him as pale as the snow outside. "Leaving? You cannot leave. The roads are not safe for a human travelling alone. The remnants of Pendleton's mercenaries are still hiding in the woods. I forbid it." "You forbid it?" Beatrice's eyes flashed with sudden, fierce defiance. "I am not your subject, Kaelin. I am a free woman. If you use your Alpha command to keep me here, you prove that you haven't changed at all. You prove that I am just another possession to be locked away when it suits you." The accusation struck him with the force of a physical blow. The Alpha King, a man who commanded legions of terrifying beasts, looked utterly shattered. His broad shoulders slumped, and for a moment he looked like a lost boy. He stared at her for a long, agonizing minute. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 1,000 unspoken words. Finally, Kaelin took a slow, painful step back toward the door. "I swore I would never lock you in a cage again," Kaelin whispered, his voice cracking with immense sorrow. "Even if that cage is my kingdom. If leaving is what you truly desire, I will not stop you. You have my blessing, Beatrice." He didn't wait for her reply. He turned and walked out into the freezing storm, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. Beatrice stood completely still, the tears she had fought so hard to hold back finally spilling over her cheeks. A heavy, mournful whine came from the corner of the room. Balthazar rose from his rug, padding over to her and pressing his massive head against her hip. She buried her face in his thick, dark fur, sobbing until her lungs ached. The dawn was brutally cold, the sky a canvas of bruised purple and grey. Beatrice sat wrapped in heavy furs in the back of a sturdy merchant wagon, her apothecary chest secured tightly beside her. The caravan, led by a burly human trader named Silas, was making its way through the dense, snow-laden pines of the Whispering Woods, the final border between the werewolf territories and the human lands. She hadn't looked back at the castle. It was too painful. To her surprise, Balthazar had not come to the cottage the night before. Kaelin had clearly kept the hound confined, knowing the beast would likely try to follow her wagon to the ends of the earth. It was for the best, she told herself. A clean break. The rhythmic crunch of the wagon wheels on the snow was hypnotizing, lulling Beatrice into a state of numb exhaustion. Suddenly, the caravan jerked to a violent halt, The horses screamed, rearing up as a massive pine tree crashed down across the narrow forest road, blocking their path entirely. "Ambush!" Silas bellowed, drawing a rusted broadsword. "Defend the wagons!" From the snow-draped shadows of the forest, a dozen men emerged. They weren't ordinary bandits. They wore the tattered crimson cloaks of Lord Pendleton's disgraced loyalists. They were rogue wolves, mercenaries who had lost everything when Kaelin purged the council, and they had been waiting for the perfect opportunity for revenge. "Well, well," sneered the leader, a heavily scarred wolf with a missing ear. He stepped toward Beatrice's wagon, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. "The little human witch who ruined our lord. The king might have let you go, but the council has a long memory." Beatrice's heart hammered against her ribs, but she didn't panic. She reached into her thick cloak, her fingers wrapping around a small, tightly sealed glass vial filled with a highly volatile mixture of sulfur, crushed saltpeter, and dried night terror spores she had concocted for extreme emergencies. "Step back," Beatrice warned, her voice steady. The rogue wolf laughed, shifting into his half-lycanthrope form, his face elongating into a terrifying, hairy snout. "Take the horses, kill the merchants, bring the girl to me. I want to send her head back to the king, in a box." Before the rogues could advance, the forest itself seemed to erupt. A roar so deafening it shook the snow from the high branches, ripped through the morning air. A massive black blur launched from the tree line directly into the chest of the lead mercenary, Balthazar. The dire hound was a force of pure, untamed destruction. His jaws snapped bone with sickening crunches, tossing fully grown werewolf mercenaries around like rag dolls. But Balthazar was not alone. Following close behind the hound was Kaelin. He wasn't wearing his royal armor. He wore simple black leathers, wielding a massive silver-forged broadsword. He hadn't let her go unprotected. He had been shadowing the caravan on foot through the freezing night, keeping out of sight, ensuring her safe passage. Kaelin moved with terrifying speed, his sword a flash of deadly silver in the pale dawn light. He cut down two rogues in rapid succession, placing his body directly between the remaining mercenaries and Beatrice's wagon. "Touch her!" Kaelin roared, his eyes glowing fiercely gold, his alpha aura exploding outward. "And I will erase your bloodlines from history." The fight was brutal and bloody. Kaelin and Balthazar fought in perfect synchronization, a deadly dance of man and beast. But they were heavily outnumbered, and the rogues were fighting with the desperation of cornered animals. One of the mercenaries, realizing he could not defeat the Alpha King in combat, slinked around the back of the wagons, raising a heavy crossbow, loaded with a silver-tipped bolt, aiming directly at Kaelin's unprotected back. Beatrice saw him. Without thinking, she stood up in the wagon, pulled the cork from her glass vial with her teeth, and hurled it directly at the crossbowman's feet. The vial shattered on the frozen ground. The chemical reaction was instantaneous. A blinding, searing flash of white light erupted, followed by a thick, suffocating cloud of acrid purple smoke that smelled of burning copper. The crossbowman shrieked, blinded by the flash, his shot going wide and burying itself harmlessly into a tree trunk. Balthazar immediately lunged into the smoke, dragging the screaming rogue down into the snow. Kaelin dispatched the last of the attackers, driving the pommel of his sword into the skull of a rogue wolf. The forest fell silent, save for the heavy panting of the king and his hound, and the groans of the wounded. Kaelin dropped his sword, leaning heavily against the wheel of Beatrice's wagon. His breathing was ragged, and a deep, bloody gash ran down his left bicep, staining his leather sleeve dark crimson. Beatrice scrambled down from the wagon, her apothecary bag already in her hands. She rushed to his side, tearing his sleeve open to inspect the wound. "You fool!" she scolded, her voice thick with emotion, her hands moving quickly to apply a sterile cloth to the bleeding gash. You followed me. In the freezing cold, you could have been killed." Cailan looked down at her, his expression remarkably serene, despite the pain and the carnage around them. "I said I wouldn't stop you from leaving. I didn't say I wouldn't protect you on your way out." He reached out his uninjured arm, gently touching the side of her face. "You saved my life just now, Beatrice. With your medicine. With your brilliant, beautiful mind." Beatrice looked into his amber eyes. There was no arrogance there, no alpha command. There was only a man who had stripped away his pride, his crown and his comfort, trudging through the snow just to make sure she was safe, expecting absolutely nothing in return. He had let her go. He had given her the ultimate choice, and in doing so, he had finally proven himself worthy of her. "Hold still," she whispered, pulling a needle and a spool of silk thread from her bag. "This is going to sting." "Are you going to York?" Cailan asked softly, wincing as she cleaned the wound with sharp alcohol. Beatrice paused. She looked at the snowy road ahead, winding toward the human cities. Then she looked back at Cailan and at Balthazar, who was sitting happily in the snow, his tail wagging despite being covered in mercenary blood. "York is too far," Beatrice said slowly, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through her guarded expression. "And I hear the King of Ethelgard is in desperate need of a new chief apothecary. One who doesn't take orders from corrupt politicians." Cailan's breath hitched, a light ignited in his eyes, brighter than the morning sun creeping over the horizon. "She can have anything she wants," Cailan whispered, pulling her gently against his chest. "As long as she never leaves me in the dark again." Beatrice wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face into his snow-damp cloak, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart. The winter in Ethelgard was cold, but the ice had finally broken. The tale of Beatrice, Cailan, and the fierce dire hound Balthazar reminds us that true loyalty isn't found in royal decrees or political alliances. It's proven in the darkest moments. When the entire world chose to believe a convenient lie, it was the pure, unfiltered intuition of an animal that saw the truth. Rebuilding broken trust takes more than just apologies. It requires sacrifice, humility, and the courage to give someone the freedom to choose you. Cailan had to lose his crown's absolute authority to win back his true queen, proving that the strongest bonds are forged not by force, but by a love that is willing to bleed for the truth. If this story of loyalty, betrayal, and redemption kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Share this video with a friend who loves epic fantasy romance, and don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling tales. Leave a comment below. What would you have done if you were Beatrice?